All right, so let's make a formal introduction for our listeners. Good afternoon, Richard. My name is Claudio. I'm calling you from Washington, D.C., from the studios in Fairfax City. We're very humble and grateful that Richard Macphail accepted our invitation to our show. Richard, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Same. I'm happy you're here, that we were able to connect. Phil, what was the first question? What was the motivation for writing the book, right? For people that don't know who you are and so forth.
Well, a few things. I retired in 2015, and from my work, and everyone always says when you retire, you need a project to keep you busy. So I thought, lots of people have said to me, you should write a book, because I thought there was a story there and worth telling. And I also thought inevitably there's going to be a lot of people who would be interested in it because of I don't know the numbers, but I believe that together and apart, Genesis have sold probably something like 400 million albums. So there's an awful lot of people out there who know and love the band and might be interested in what I had to say. So, but the other thing, with slightly tongue-in-cheek, is that on the first live album, Genesis Live, there was a dedication to me, and a lot of people thought that the dedication was saying that I was dead. And people have often met me over the years and said, but I thought Richard Macphail was dead. And so I thought it would be good to lay that rumor to rest and knock on wood. I'm still very much alive, and that was another reason to write the book.
Good for you, man. Good for you. I think on the other side of the band, I think it says in memory of Richard Macphail, and if you read in memory, in fact, this guy passed away or something.
It says who left.
Who left?
And and some people thought that was a euphemism for that I died. So there's all these people in the world who don't know who Richard Macphail is, but what they know is that he's dead. So I wanted to dispel that rumor.
Absolutely. Feel free to elaborate. Thank you very much. Feel free to elaborate on the earliest memory that you have from the Charterhouse. By the way, in the UK, in some other country, they will call that a public school. Here in the United States, we call that a private school.
Exactly.
And a private school can be border school, or can be your kids go in the morning and come back to home.
But it's a fee-paying school.
It's a fee-paying school, right?
Yeah, it was. That is the right name for it. It is a private school, but it's the history. It goes back a long way when actually they weren't fee-paying schools. They were public. Before there was, going back several centuries, but because Charterhouse was founded in London in 1611, and schools then were all run by the church. Generally it was the clergy who were the ones who could read and write and therefore educate people. And so they were public schools, but it is a misnomer. They're very private, and they're very expensive, and they're generally meant for the sort of, upper echelons of society who are going to go on. The idea was that you go to a school like Charterhouse, you get into Oxford or Cambridge, correct, and then you become a lawyer or a doctor and or a politician. Our current government has an inordinate number of people who went to various public schools, in particular Eton, Boris Johnson, etc. So the system still works that way, but you weren't meant to come out of that school and be in a rock band.
I have my personal feeling about sending kids to. I have my son just turned 19, and sending the kids to the boarding school. I have mixed feeling about it. I think I see good points and bad points about sending the kids away. I don't know but that's what people do. I'm not here to judge.
Well, no, personally, I don't approve of it. You go to a country like some of the Scandinavian countries, they just don't have private schools. Everybody goes into the school system, the public school system, and I think that they're better for it. But the other problem with the so-called public school system is that you don't just go to a public school when you're 13. You go to what's called a prep school. It stands for preparatory, to prepare you for public school when you're 8. And there's no doubt that sending an 8-year-old boy away to be looked after by people who don't love them is I think, an abomination, and it does enormous emotional damage. I don't know whether you heard my show where I had Tony Banks on my radio show, and Radio Rich Pickings, and we were talking about this, and he said there's no doubt that I was damaged emotionally being sent away that young. Yeah. Because suddenly you're in this strange place with all of these, and I mean, you know, it's what went on there. I mean, a lot of them were of good intention, and the prep school I went to, I believe, was a good one. And after the initial shock of essentially being banished, sent away, not understanding at aged 8 what the hell was going on, and why was my mother crying when we got in the car to go away? You know, what? So, you know, I was going, well, I thought I was meant to be the child and she the adult. And anyway, but the truth is, after I got used to it, I actually quite enjoyed it. But I know Tony didn't. He absolutely hated it. Yeah. And so, I mean, that's the problem. I recently read an incredibly good book called Sad Little Men, about very, very clearly and well laid out the damage that is done to young boys sent away at that age. And he particularly focuses, because he's the same age as them, on Boris Johnson and David Cameron, 2 of our recent prime ministers. And the problem with those people being sent away, being damaged, and then becoming bloody prime minister of a country is a problem for everybody.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. I wanted to ask you the question, but I didn't know how you will react, because I didn't know what was your position. That I'm very clear to me what I would. I think here, at least here in the United States, Richard, before we move to a different point, if you have good parents and schooling, education is important, you have the same chance to the top school in the country, whether you went to a boarding school or where you went to a public school and your parents were teaching you at home and stuff. They probably, the probabilities increase going to a public school in your case because the degree of difficulty is higher and so on and so forth, but it takes an emotional toll, right? That's what
I know people who went to private schools in America. There's one in Vermont called Putney School. And 2 good friends went there. But the thing about them is that they were at home until they were 13. And then they went. And, I think the damage is far less at that age.
Correct.
Because you can understand what's going on. And I know people in this country who didn't send their children to prep schools. They waited until the children were 12 and 13 and actually gave them the choice. And I know at least 2 young people who, when they got to that age, said, yes, I if you want to send me to this school, they're obviously incredibly well endowed, and the facilities are amazing, and the opportunities are amazing. And, the young people actually chose to go to boarding schools.
Perfect.
And enjoyed it and didn't regret it. So I think that's a much better way of doing it.
I understand. And in your life, you began playing, you were a drummer, and then...
no.
And then, I'm going...
I wasn't a drummer. Rivers Joe thought I was a drummer. God bless him. He turned out to be a man of tremendous clear vision and intelligence. But that afternoon, when he heard me drumming, I don't know what he thought, but thank God he did, because as you know, that's what led to him introducing me to Ant, and that was a life-changing. Both Rivers and Ant were responsible for in very important events and life-changing incidents in my early life. Yes.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to interview Anthony Phillips, affectionately known as Ant, and he was a very nice person too. What the first memory you have of Anthony Phillips? I read in the book that you thought that he was way ahead of everybody else at the time.
He was. Well, Rivers was too.
Really?
But yeah, I mean, I remember the day that Rivers told me about Eric Clapton. I guess we were probably 13. Yeah. And he said, "There's this guitarist who people are calling God." Turned out to be that Jeff Beck was really the God, but that's another story.
Oh yeah.
But Rivers said, "Meet me at Marble Arch, and we'll get the bus down to Ant's house." And as you might expect, being public school boys. Ant's father was a merchant banker, so they were quite well off, and they had a big house in a suburb of southwest London called Putney. And Rivers and I went on the bus. Rivers had his bass guitar with him, and the contrast. What was my strongest memory of the day is that at this point. My parents were extremely worried about how my education was going. And they were right to be, because they were investing a lot of money in this education that they wanted me to have. And all I was interested in was music. And they didn't like or understand the music that I liked. So I get to Ant's house. So I go from my house where it's like this, the whole time, and my school reports getting worse and worse every time. And there's Ant's house where the dining room on the right of the front door, everything was cleared away, and that it had been turned into a rehearsal studio. And there was Ant's mother, grandmother, and aunt, who were just all over us and couldn't be encouraging enough. We must have been making a terrible noise, and they were going, "Oh, darlings, it sounds so wonderful," And then after a couple of hours of crashing around, they'd produced this wonderful lunch, and that it was just like another world to me, where parents were encouraging of our efforts, and it was true later particularly of Mike Rutherford's parents. His father was a retired sea captain from the Navy, but his mother, just was unbelievably encouraging of our efforts, and it made a lot of difference. So that was the main thing, but also Ant's talent. Every time we mentioned a song, he just seemed to be able to play it, and clearly he was a deeply musical point. At this point, he hadn't started writing songs, and what we all loved the Stones, so we tended to do a lot of Stones covers. Excuse me. But it soon emerged that I was not the drummer that Rivers had hoped that I was, and wasn't slow just to say, "Listen, can you sing?"
Yeah.
And so my head was full of early Stones songs, so I started singing, and it all went from there. Turned out that Ant had a friend round the corner who was also at Charterhouse, Rob Tyrrell, who was an incredibly good drummer. Yeah. So with the addition of Mike on rhythm guitar, and when I talked to Mike about the early days, he said, when I first met Ant, I probably knew 3 chords, and Ant taught me everything I know about playing the guitar. So Ant was the giant of the musical scene at that time.
Well, that's a great story. Anthony, so it's fair to say that when Anthony Phillips and River Job formed the Anon. I think it's called Anon after that.
The name was my idea.
Yeah.
I wanted it to be, well, partly at Charterhouse, doing what we were doing was not appreciated by the faculty. You could do anything you wanted at Charterhouse. You could jump out of aeroplanes, you could make pots, you could swim, you could, play any sport, the facilities. But the thing we wanted to do was to be a band. And so as Mike actually later again described it, he said it was like a sort of musical underground. We got to know who was into doing music, and sort of we connected up, as I say, slightly as an underground. So the idea of us being anonymous, I thought, was a good name. So the name was Anon, like you get with a poem when they don't know who wrote the poem, or a folk song or something like that. It's just Anon. So unfortunately, nobody could cope with the idea of not having the definite article. So we became known as the Anon, and we've never been able to shake that off. So I suppose in that respect, probably wasn't a very good name, because it's no good if you have a name and people get it wrong all the time. But be that as it may, Anon is what we were.
And all of you were living in different houses or so. So how you were able to connect, and then there were equipment somewhere, a piano, or
well, yes.
Somewhere, or?
I mean, we again, you see, most of the equipment we had been bought by the parents, and I don't know where we had a very rudimentary PA for me to sing through, but. Ant had a Fender Stratocaster. You couldn't ask for a better guitar. Rivers had a Fender bass, and so the instruments we had were good, but the rest of the stuff was pretty rubbishy, as it was, to be honest with you, right through to when Genesis got started. Our equipment was appalling. But anyway, that's so. But we knew that some of the teachers, the masters, were more sympathetic than others, and so we would ask them if we could use their classrooms on a Saturday afternoon, and we would get a trolley from the groundsman, the people who would prepare the cricket pitches and stuff for games, and load up the trolley with our gear, motley collection of gear, and wheel it out to wherever the classrooms were that we'd managed to secure. To rehearse for a few hours on a Saturday afternoon. So that's how we did it.
I got it. Perfect. And then, you came into the picture, and after that, Rutherford joined the trio, right?
Yeah. And our drummer, Rob Tyrrell.
Rob Tyrrell.
So that was the band. We had the same lineup as the Stones: lead guitar, rhythm guitar, bass, drums, and singer.
And then after that, you guys, then Peter came with Tony, right? I think Peter Gabriel was a friend of Tony Banks, and then how Tony get into the new you guys?
Well, Peter, Tony, and Ant actually were all in the same house, so they knew each other well. And Peter and Tony, when there were break times, when they were allowed to play, there was a piano in their common room, which is interesting because there wasn't in my house. So why there was a piano there, I don't know, but it certainly made a big difference to the story. The two of them would race each other to get to the piano first, so they could start playing and improvising and early days of composing. But Ant was mostly focused on our group. But excuse me, I'm just going to get a glass of water.
Sure.
Okay. So
go ahead.
The summer of 1966 turned out to be the last term at Charterhouse for me and Rivers.
Yeah.
And because education wasn't going well, our parents decided to send us elsewhere, different schools. So Anon were left without a singer and a bass player.
Mm.
And funnily enough, Genesis never did get a bass player. And obviously Mike plays bass, and Daryl plays bass on when they play live. Mike plays bass pedals, but actually they never had a bass player, which is a funny thing. So, but Ant and Mike said to Peter, because Ant knew Peter could sing, "Do you want to join our group?" And he said, "I'll join if I can." No, I'm sorry, I'm getting the story wrong. They asked Tony Banks to come and join on piano.
Well,
and he said, if I can bring along my friend Peter, because he's turning into quite a good singer. So that's essentially how Genesis got started. Chris Stewart, the first drummer, was also in the same house as them. And so they asked him to play the drums, and they formed this group called the Garden Wall.
Right.
And that was the beginning of Genesis.
So the Anon, and then later on the Garden Wall are the genesis of Genesis.
Yeah, exactly. And Ant was in both bands.
I got it. Yeah, I think Anthony Phillips was thinking at the time, but I think I read in the book that when Ant talked to Tony, with Tony Banks, say, no, don't stop the singing. Just wait until my buddy Peter Gabriel, come to our meeting next Saturday or whatever it was, and that's okay, and then it would make a big difference, right? So
yeah,
well, amazing.
It did, yeah.
Amazing. Before I forget that, although I have my, my perhaps negative view about public school, private school here in the United States, if it wasn't for the Charterhouse, all those kids joined about the same time with the same kind of parents, kind of well-off parents, sending the kids away to, we wouldn't have this unbelievable band, So
no, and the other thing to bear in mind, of course, is what happened in the early 60s. Yeah. See, we were all born in 1950. So in 1965, we were 15. And you think about what's going on in 1963, 4, 5, the music scene is exploding.
That's right. Yeah.
It's all so exciting and so innovative. And to this day, everyone's listening to the music that was being produced then. It's funny. We're talking the day after Burt Bacharach died, and he's part of the story. The kind of the music that he was producing back then. Unbelievable songs with Hal David. So that was the context that this was going on in.
Yeah. The Led Zeppelin, the Pink Floyd, the Rolling Stone, the Genesis, they were way ahead of what was going on in the United States at the time, of course.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It's unbelievable. So eventually you guys save enough money and book an hour at a recording studio called Tony Pike Sounds, right?
Oh, well, that was still in the days. That was when Anon. That was before Garden Wall, when Anon still existed. But it was 1966. It was earlier on. Yes, we saved up enough money for 1 hour, and I thought, wow, each song's only 3 or 4 minutes. We're going to get so much done in an hour. Of course, as you know, recording it's a very slow process.
That's right.
We managed to get one song done, which was a song Ant had written called Pennsylvania Flick House.
Yeah, which I think is in YouTube somewhere, right?
Which is on it's on Spotify. If anyone wants to listen to it, just put in Pennsylvania Flick House and you'll find it. And in fact, it has finally found its way on a release. Ant's done a big archive CD. And it's on there as well. So it has its place in history.
Yeah, I got it. I need to check that out. And you guys began getting gigs at Paris during the holiday, right?
Just for friends and stuff. Yeah. And there were hops at school, and so we started to play live a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. What's the first impression that you got from you had from Peter Gabriel? He was different, I think, right? Or
Well, first of all, when that concert that we put on that was Anon and the Garden Wall, one of the things Peter had done is he designed a hat that looks not unlike what you Americans would recognize as a pilgrim's hat. If you're driving on I-90 in Massachusetts,
yep,
you see the hat. Well, it looks a bit like that one. And he had 100 of them made and went about selling them. So this concert was apart from anything else, it was a showcase for his hat because he wore it on stage and probably sold a few as a result. So, he was very shy. I hardly said 2 words to him while we were at Charterhouse, even though we were sort of, I would never say we were rivals. I didn't feel that we were rivals, and I didn't feel that I was ousted by him. I have read people saying that, but they're seeing too much in it because we had no choice, essentially. My parents decided to take me away from Charterhouse at the end of the summer of 1966. So that left the whole field open. So that was the end of it. But to be honest, I didn't get to know Peter until we moved into the cottage, which was 3 years later. That was the autumn of 1969. So we're jumping ahead a bit. All I just remember is he was quirky, eccentric, and very shy, and he still is.
Tony also is very shy as well. Why you think? And Steve Hackett also. What you think has something to do with parents in a way? The kids become more introvert or shy, or had nothing to do with it.
I don't know. No. It's too complex to go into. But the truth is that for whatever reason, these people were very creative and they needed an outlet. And that was a way of, it's not uncommon for actors who, go flat out on screen or in the theatre, or singers who do the same on stage. Off screen, they're quite shy. And this is the way they have found to express themselves
as an outlet to the Chinese to
a safe outlet.
Yeah. And then I read in your book that you mentioned that Tony Banks also, he is still very shy, but he knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he was.
Well, that's the thing. He's such a contrast. He's incredibly intelligent. And very clear, but has incredibly strong will. So, as you say, he knows exactly what he wants and what he doesn't want, and he is shy, but when it comes to it, he's not backward in saying what he wants. Yeah, so he's very strong-willed. Obviously, Peter is too. Yeah, and that stood them in very good stead. When in the early days, when, as we all know, it's not difficult. You've got a band and you're trying to break it, and especially early Genesis. They weren't a normal kind of band. They immediately you hear the early stuff and it's different. Yeah.
Before we go to the Christmas cottage, I suppose that all of them, like Peter and Peter Gabriel and Tony Banks, they have strong personality, and I suppose that there was clash, among themselves. And I think you mentioned the book that if it wasn't for you, I think Mark Rutherford mentioned if it wasn't for you, that you were around in the house, the guys would have killed one another because, right? Or not literally.
It was a nice thing for him to say, but because this is like a crucible. One of the unusual things about Genesis is that they were all writers.
That's right, yeah.
Most bands, that's not the case. You look at this Lennon, McCartney, Jagger, Richards, one guy writes the songs and the other guy writes the words. and the other three just play what they're told, sort of thing. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but with Genesis, that wasn't the case. They were all coming up with ideas and bashing it out, and this is you. This is I'm expressing who I am, deep in my soul, and so I'm going to defend this, and also I don't want anybody playing it down. So it's bound to be a very highly strung and emotional process. And possibly I was some sort of brought some leveling influence to the proceedings, not consciously at the time, I have to say, but I can look back now, when I hear the others talking about what it was like for them and see the effect that I might have had on occasions. But Peter and Tony shared a room. I mean, I'm inevitably now moving towards the cottage, but when we were in the cottage, Peter and Tony shared a room, and it was only a small place. We were all piled on top of each other, but they both of them have said they were fine about that. It was never really a problem. There may have been a few moods here and there at the end of the day, but generally they got on fine.
Perfect. Yeah. Feel free to elaborate on who Jonathan King was and the first demo with 3 or 4 singles that the band was able to put together and send it to him. What was the? Well,
there was a guy his passion was essentially recording and radio and stuff, and he went on to work for the BBC. So it was a perfect job for him. His name was Brian Roberts.
Yeah.
And he was a pal of Ant's. And the obvious thing is Brian wants to play at being a record producer or an engineer, and the band want to record. So, they made a demo tape. And another friend of ours who's still a good friend of Mike's, called John Alexander, we always called him Al, and we still call him Al. He had the courage when Jonathan King came down to Charterhouse. He came down for a victory tour after he had a big hit with Everyone's Gone to the Moon. John approached him and gave him the tape, and he dutifully listened to it. And he said he thought there was definitely some writing talent there, but particularly he liked Peter's voice. So they ended up working with him. But he was for him, this was a departure of producing another band. And he didn't, apart from actually the music, playing and singing, he didn't really want that much input from them. So when they would make a recording, when it came to mixing it, he would throw them out of the studio, which drove them nuts. I can understand both points of view. But as you say, they did a few singles with him, Silent Sun and Winter's Tale, and they were both extremely good. Silent Sun especially, seriously could have been a hit. But I've always thought it would have been a disaster if it had been a hit, because it probably would have tied them in with Jonathan King, who definitely wanted he wanted to make pop singles. But also, I think success at that stage, where there were 17, would have been very damaging. And I think it all turned out for the best, very much.
Yeah, in many ways, I think I read somewhere that King noticed the band's tendency to expand and complicate arrangement, and he liked that stuff. He wanted to do like straightforward pop songs, 3-4 minutes, 3-4 minutes.
Yeah.
But Genesis, they wanted, like I said, they wanted to do complicated arrangement, different chord changes before the mellotron, before they got the mellotron, and that's what they became famous for. They were, as you say, they were many, very, very different too.
Well, that especially Tony Banks, because what drives him is harmony.
Yeah. And
the chords, melody as well, obviously, but that's what he brought to the party. So that's inevitably the direction that they would have gone in.
And eventually they were able to record from Genesis to Revelation in March 1969 at Decca. Yeah. And I think from Decca point of view, they felt that was like a disappointment. I have listened to the record. Of course, I have a huge music collection, Richard, here in the house, and the album is not bad. I mean,
no, I know.
For now, 1923 is not bad. Maybe at the time, it was different for what the audience was waiting for, or the radio were playing. So it's bad or disappointing.
Yeah. The thing is that I think the record shows that Decca had seriously lost their way back then. Because they famously turned down the Beatles.
That's right.
So they didn't know their arse from their elbow, frankly. So when something like Genesis comes along, even the Jonathan King version of Genesis, they did not know what to do with it. But ultimately, as I say, I think it worked out for the best, because if that had been a big hit, I think things would have been very different.
Yeah, looking back, that was, and then also Jonathan King got in all kind of trouble with the law and stuff that I don't want to mention here, but in a way that was.
Yeah, you can look it up on the internet.
Yeah, thanks God that things went different way, and Genesis wasn't labeled like a pop band, right? Because then we wouldn't have the Genesis that we know nowadays. So
no,
yeah, and then so Genesis moved to the Christmas cottage. Feel free to elaborate.
Well, yeah, while the Jonathan King thing was all going on,
yeah,
I went to Israel to work on a kibbutz.
Yeah,
and as I waited for 6 months, and I came back in the summer of 1969. I mean, they carried on rehearsing and writing. They were just moving forward, and they were planning to go to college. Peter was going to go to film school. God knows what the movies he would have produced would have been like, but we shall never know. So I went down they were at Anne's house outside Guildford, and things had really moved on. And I sat down and they played me 2 or 3 songs they were working on at the time. And I thought, wow, this is, and I suppose you could say at that point I fell in love with them. And they became my vocation. And amazingly, coincidentally, my parents had a cottage that they were going to sell the following spring. And I said, can we use it for the winter? And amazingly, they said yes. So my dad used to work for a bread company. He got us an old bread van. And so we had a cottage and a van. So that's when, as Mike Rutherford puts it very well, he said, at the cottage we became a band. So it was a special time. So we moved in I think October 69, and we were there for 4 or 5 months. And every day would be writing and rehearsing. And then Peter and I would be on the phone trying to get gigs, and, things started to happen. And then early in 1970, we met Tony Stratton Smith of Charisma.
Yep.
And he signed the band, and we left the cottage. And what happened at the cottage basically was Trespass. That was the album that they wrote, created. And so we left the cottage, moved to London, went on a wage. Suddenly we were able to buy better equipment, and, the whole machine started to roll under the auspices of the great Strat, as he was known, Tony Stratton Smith. Yeah.
Although you mentioned that, although you didn't become a doctor or a lawyer or a politician, your parents still like you enough to, let you do your thing and let the house and the band. So you have loving parents,
I know. There was some degree of acceptance from them, I suppose, that this is what I wanted to do.
That's right. The rock and roll in this kid is not going away. So we better help him,
Well,
because
yeah,
that's
probably
going to be his life,
to their deathbeds. They wished that it had gone away, but it didn't. So they did. It was an incredible gift for them to lend us the cottage and get a van.
Yeah,
and it was a career for me for as long as I wanted it to be.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
I'm back. I just sneezed.
Yeah. So when I see you, Londo, I will tell you my story. It's a similar story that you have, Richard. My parents were very pissed off at me too, and I did okay in my life,
Yeah.
And music was similar. Music was my thing. I knew that I wanted to do, and the rest is history, So
yeah.
And Trespass sold 6,000 copies. I think I read of the still at the time 6,000 was good enough, or probably not, right? A little bit.
Well, I'll tell you, it's quite likely that if under different circumstances in different times, if a record company signs a band and their first album sells 600 copies, that would be it probably.
Yeah.
But again, this was the vision of Tony Smith, who loved Genesis, and he was prepared for the long haul. Ooh. And he was, because I don't know how many copies that Nursery Crime sold, but probably not that many more, even with an incredible endorsement from Keith Emerson, who was a huge star at this point, a very old friend of Strat's. And he wrote this amazing thing in the music press saying, one day this Genesis are going to be huge and you're going to wish you were on the ground floor. But Nursery Crime, it just was a slow growth process, which I think in the long term was very good for the band.
Exactly.
That's one of the reasons they lasted as long as they did. Because you look at all the other bands, and look what's going on in the Pink Floyd right now. Right now, people, the band, the Eagles, they had Hotel California, and the success of that completely destroyed them. Okay, I mean they came back and all the rest of it, but Genesis have always been incredibly strong, and you can analyze, the characters of Peter, Tony, Mike, Phil, etc., and know why they were able to keep going, moving forward for so many decades. Yep. But Strat was, fortunately for us, Tony's Charisma also had Lindisfarne, who were incredibly successful, sold bucket loads of records and had hits and huge, they just did really well. And that brought a load of cash into Charisma. And they invested that in Genesis, amongst other bands. So we were very fortunate to have Strat, because he invested hundreds of thousands of pounds to keep the band going. Yeah. And it wasn't really till Selling England by the Pound, that things started to kick off. And,
he began recording the investment. As you can see in Trespass, Looking for Someone, The Knife, those are monumental tracks that at the time they were, and you can see that every track there was 7 minutes, 6 minutes, The Knife 9 minutes, so Stagnation 50-51. So it was a different They want longer tracks and chord changes and different sections. So it's very different.
What I often say to that is that something that Mike Rutherford said. People say to him, "Well, why do these really long songs?" And he said very honestly, he said, good short songs are much harder. And when you think of the Beatles and ABBA, that's what they were so good at. They did these unbelievable short songs that were just brilliant. And Mike would say that at the time they weren't up for that. They got there later, much later, obviously in the Phil era. That they got shorter songs. They produced singles that have been hits, etc. But it's also true because of the way that they created a song. was by taking bits that, Mike and Ant, for instance, would have a guitar pick that they would have been playing the night before, after supper. And then Tony would have something, and then Peter would have something, and they would bring them together. And partly because of Tony's skill with the harmonies and the chords, he knew how they could knit them together and make them into a song. But that inevitably meant that the songs were a series of bits instead of being, verse, chorus, middle eight, back to verse and the last chorus. That was the form that most pop songs took for many years, and to a certain extent still does. But the way that Genesis created the music was very different. So that's why the songs tended to be 8, 9, 10, or ultimately 23 minutes.
That's right. Yeah, I know exactly. Was the Genesis was doing the college circuit at the time, right? To learn a little bit of money and get exposed, and it's smaller venues, not many people, right? So
there were two things. There were a bunch of clubs, which inevitably they were so-called clubs, and they would have one gig one night of the week, and they were in rooms above or the back of pubs. And so the landlords put on the gigs to bring people in to buy beer. And so that was one scene. And the other, as you rightly say, is that all the universities and colleges and everything else. I mean, The Who very famously made a live album at Leeds University, and they all had, typically once a month, they'd have a dance, and it was put on by the Students' Union. So the students chose the bands, and we, by this point, had an agent, and they put our name out along with everybody else, and someone would go, a classic example of this is Brian May from Queen, who was at Imperial College studying to be an astronomer, and he was on the Students' Union, and he was hip to Genesis, and so we got booked to play there on a Saturday night, thanks to him, and it was a big gig. There were a lot of people there. The colleges were always really well attended. Trouble is, mostly they wanted to drink beer and dance. And so, but Genesis weren't like that. You couldn't dance to Genesis because the time signatures kept changing. Really, what we wanted them to do was to sit down and listen. And eventually, people got it, and they started doing that. But it always took a while. But eventually, they could dance to the knife. So, and until it went slow in the middle, they were all going along, and then so. But yes, those were the two ways that we were able to earn a bit of money and get out there.
Right? Is it fair to say that Peter at the time was the principal lyric writer at the time?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, he was, and also all the others on stage were sitting down. Mike, Steve, or Ant earlier, obviously Phil and Tony. So he was also the one who was the focus and becoming the front man, realizing that he needed to dance about and wiggle his bottom to keep a bit of visual interest going. Because we didn't have any lights or anything at this point. It was it's pretty boring stuff, but people liked the music.
Absolutely. And then eventually, I think Anthony Phillips ended up leaving the band. I think he, feel free to elaborate on his acute stage fright, but I read somewhere also a different point of view but feel free to elaborate on that. And I think I will present another point of view as well that I read somewhere.
Well, he started to, most of the time we were playing to about 20 people, but it didn't make any difference, and started to get incredibly nervous and got stage fright. But ultimately we realized that he had what we call glandular fever. In America, I think it's known as mono, and it's like a nervous illness. And so in the summer of 1970, having just done Trespass and got the deal with Charisma, and it was all coming together. Yeah. He told Peter that he was going to leave. And we were playing at a club, a famous club in the West End of London called the Marquee. And we were in where you load the gear at the back of the Marquee. We had the van, and our gear was all on stage. We played our set, and we were waiting for the main band to finish so that we could load out. And there was Peter, Tony, Mike, and me. And we were in the back of the van, and Peter said, Ants announced that he's leaving. And it was a shock. I didn't realize that he was feeling that bad. He hadn't confided in me. And I was astonished that the mood was that the band wouldn't survive this.
Really?
And so I very strongly put forward my point of view is that we've got a record deal. We've got a good album coming out. Blah blah blah. You know, we can go on. And we argued back and forth, pros and cons. And eventually, Tony Banks said, "Well, if we do go on, this would be a chance to get a better drummer." The drummer at the time was John Mayhew, who was perfectly proficient drummer, but he wasn't what Genesis needed. They needed a much more creative and musical drummer. And so it was agreed. And of course, the history books will tell that the drummer we got was Phil Collins. And the difference he made was unbelievable. It was totally, I couldn't believe how much difference a drummer could make.
Really?
And it took some time for Steve to show up. But eventually he did, so that by the autumn of 1970, the classic band was in place.
That's right.
And
feel free to elaborate to how Phil Collins auditioned and joining the band in August at the time. And I think they put an ad somewhere, or was the Melody Maker, or not? That when I know that Peter Gabriel had a house on the swimming pool, right? And then invite all the guys to the swimming pool, and then they were calling one by one.
Yeah, that was his parents' house.
Yeah,
and in Surrey, a place called Chobham. Yeah. That's where Peter, his parents lived for their whole lives, and it's where Peter was brought up. So same thing as that first day with Ant. You know, the living room, everything was pushed aside, and they set up all the equipment. And it was the summertime; it was hot. And Phil was third on the list.
Yeah.
But Phil being Phil, you know, he got there an hour early because he was always like that, just keen. He's like a puppy dog. And so the windows were all open, and he was hanging out by the pool until it was his turn. And, of course, he's so quick, he could hear what was going on. And he just set his kit up and boom, just played it. And there was no question that he was the one that they would choose. So that's how he got the gig. Yeah.
Do you think it was an advantage for him to be third? So he listened to the first one, he put an eye, listened to the second guy, and then what was his term? I know what the band is looking for, and or the work make a difference because the guy was
to be honest, if he'd been first, I don't think the outcome would have been any different.
I see.
You know, because he's very quick, very musical. Because we didn't know at this point, and for some years, we just considered him to be an incredible drummer. Yeah. But then, of course, the rest all happened, and
that's right.
it was crazy. So, you know, once again, you know, really, another writer. I mean, that was the difference between him and John Mayhew. Basically, they had to tell him what to play, and he did it. I mean, you can hear him playing on Trespass. It's not bad.
Yeah,
it's not Phil. Trespass would sound incredibly different if Phil had played on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, before I forget, we're talking about Genesis. So I need to.
Oh, well done.
I need to.
Last domino
for the occasion. Yeah, from London, from the London gig, and then how? Feel free to elaborate how Steve Hackett came to the picture as well.
Well, it's the same paper. The main music paper was weekly, came out on a Thursday, It's called Melody Maker. And in the back of Melody Maker, first of all, there'd be all the gigs. You know, all the colleges and clubs, etc. They'd all post their gigs in the back pages, and then it was also small ads for people looking for musicians or looking for to join bands and stuff. And Steve wrote quite an amusing, quite telling thing, saying he was looking for a band with different outlet. He just didn't want to play in a blues band, etc. So it was kind of ready made. You know, he loved 12-string, and so they went to audition him, and it was clear that he was just the right guy. So he got the gig, and we went off to Wales and played in a school, and then the next day, the day after, we played at the Lyceum, which at the time was a big Sunday gig in London, and he thought he'd done really badly. He thought he was going to be sacked. At the end of the gig, it finished and everybody walked off, and he didn't really know what to do. He was kind of standing there, a bit shell-shocked, looking a bit lost, and I stepped up and said, "Look, come off stage." So took care of him. But the band weren't, because they were fucked up public school boys. Nobody said, "You're doing really well, Steve. It's great." Blah blah blah. I was the only one who did. But because I was encouraging, he decided to stay on and give it another couple of weeks. He told me that only last year. A few months ago, so it was funny how I made myself a role back in those days. But it was clear at that point that you got Phil and Steve and the other three, and what came next was Foxtrot. So it really started to come into place then.
And then toward the end of 1970, they bought a Mellotron, right, for King Crimson, I think.
Well, Steve, that was all Steve. Yeah. Steve adored King Crimson. I mean, I have to say, so did I. I went to see the Stones in the park. They played a free gig in Hyde Park in July '69. I think it was July, and because King Crimson had just had their 50th anniversary in 2019, but Steve had been going to see them every Sunday night at the Marquee, and he just loved them. And he later became really good friends with Ian MacDonald, who was the original keyboard mellotron sax player, etc. And he wanted Genesis to sound more like an orchestra. And he thought, well, that's what King Crimson can do, and they do that because they've got a mellotron. And he kept going, banging on, and he eventually wore Tony down. Because Tony wasn't keen at the beginning, but so that was very much Steve, and Steve knew all the guys in Crimson, and there'd been a fire in a rehearsal room, so they had this instrument that was, damaged on the outside but not on the inside, and we bought it from them. And that's when I first met Robert Fripp.
Yeah,
and obviously. When you listen to Foxtrot, you hear the difference that the mellotron made. Because Tony being Tony, once he'd embraced the idea, he did unbelievable things with it. Like when you move on to Selling England, the Voices on which was a mellotron sound on Dancing with the Moonlit Night. It's absolutely spine chilling. It's still. Makes the hair stand up the back of my head when that comes on. So that's how we got the mellotron.
Yeah, so that instrument obviously provided a lot more opportunities, like Watcher of the Sky and many others. So it make a big difference. Like you say, like before Phil Collins and after Phil Collins, before the mellotron and after the mellotron, it's a different band and provided a lot more opportunity.
Well, Tony's progression, if I can just say this, I mean, Tony was a piano player.
Yeah.
But, you couldn't take a piano with you on the road those days. You can now, of course, with all the incredible instruments. So he had to become an organ player. So, in Trespass, the only instrument he plays is the organ. And then when Ant left, because we took a while to replace a guitarist and we had gigs, Tony got himself a Hohner electric piano, put it on top of the organ, plugged it into a fuzz box, and he would play Ant's solos with his right hand and play the chords on the organ with his left hand. So that was nursery crime. And then came the mellotron, and of course, Foxtrot, the sound changed enormously. So Tony was always progressing forward, increasing his palette, as it were, from what he had to create with. And he was so good at it. It's brilliant, the way he came up with really innovative stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. Who was doing the mixing, the sound, and working the lights and the venue?
Live, I did the sound live.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
With whatever we had. And eventually this guy came along called Adrian Selby, who he loved playing about with the lights, and he managed to get some quite unusual. They were imported from America. We hadn't seen them before, and they did look quite different. We didn't have very many of them, but he did produce quite a good light show. And we had some effects and enough to play with to make the band not only sound different but look different as well at this point eventually. So he was a great contribution, Adrian.
By the way, do you know if there are tapes available or decent quality for the early gigs, the college circus stuff, or no? Probably.
No, I never heard any.
Yeah.
It's just
after
something.
70, 72, 73, they're coming around. But
I mean, it's one of my great regrets is that I didn't have a camera.
Yeah, wow.
Like at the cottage, got one later, but basically, people didn't have cameras like the way they do, or eventually did. So I it never occurred to me to record anything. Not until. Just before, 72, 73, as you say, live tapes started to appear. But before that, I'd never heard any. Probably a good thing. It's probably better in our heads.
Really? Yeah. Leave out the memories, yeah. And you mentioned also in the book that you guys were playing a small cab, and one night you were playing together with the early lineup of Queen. Feel free to elaborate. That's important as well,
Yeah. Yeah.
That's great. And then I think many people think Italy was the first time Genesis toured outside UK, but it was in Belgium, right? You mentioned
Belgium was the first foreign gig. Yeah. And that was organized by one guy who was a huge fan, and he invited the band to come and play. He put on the gig. He turned this huge crowd of people onto the band. It was amazing. And so it was but then a little while later, we went to Italy. That would be April 72. And it was a bit mind-blowing because suddenly we would turn up at some little town, Reggio Emilia or something like that, and there'd be thousands of people, and they all knew the music. They all had the album under their arms. That would be nursery crime at that point.
Yeah, that's right.
We were playing the music of Foxtrot, but the album hadn't been released, and the reception was incredible, and it was terribly important because it was taking a long time to make it. It was a very slow progression. It was just gigging, and every time we'd come back to some place, there'd be more people there. And the fees gradually started creeping up, and so on. Go to Italy, and it's like bang, and it was incredibly encouraging for the band because they thought, well, if Italy can take to us, so can other places. That's so, right. And for that reason, when Genesis went on the road in 2007 in Europe, the last show was in Rome, and it was a free concert. And it was to give thanks to Italy for that early encouragement, that it was a big boost to everybody's